Doctor Who, An Unearthly Child. What can I say about this one that hasn't been said? It's the very beginning of Doctor Who. It's the start of a journey that's coming up on 60 years now. It's been examined and analyzed by people far smarter than me. And the truth of the matter is that anything that I can say about it will probably have been said before. But it's such a fascinating episode, and it's such a landmark piece of television that it's really worth examining. And it's the first episode of my favorite show, so I'm going to take a look at it. I'm going to make a few assumptions, one of which is that you've seen it. If you haven't, go and check it out. I believe you can check it out on BritBox. It replays on a fairly regular basis on Pluto TV. I'm reasonably sure the DVDs are still available. It comes as part of the beginning set. And I would say the chances are really good that in the next couple of years we'll get the first season of classic Doctor Who on Blu-ray. In fact, I'd be very surprised if we don't get it as the 60th anniversary, so November of 2023. I'm going to be examining the broadcast version of the episode. There is also an unaired pilot version of the episode, and there are some differences between the two. I feel that the broadcast version is definitely the better of the two, and I will go into some of the reasons for that later. I'm also, when I say I'm looking at An Unearthly Child, I mean I'm looking at the very first episode of the series, not the first 4-episode serial, which is also called An Unearthly Child, though sometimes it gets called 100,000 BC or The Tribe of Gum, but I believe the official name for it is still An Unearthly Child. Nevertheless, I'm looking at just the first episode in this video. Why am I just looking at the first episode? Well, if you saw my first video on Doctor Who, you'll see that I grew up in one of the few places in the US where PBS showed classic Doctor Who in episodic form, not in omnibus format where they smush all the different episodes of a serial together, kind of like a little movie. So part of it is nostalgia. That's how I first saw it. Part of it also is that I believe that Doctor Who, classic Doctor Who, was paced and written for individual episodes, not for omnibus format. When you watch it in omnibus form, I find that an awful lot of the longer versions end up feeling very padded and repetitious. But when you watch the show in its original episodic form, the padding turns out to be the plots of the individual episodes, because each episode has a plot as opposed to there just being an overall plot. And the repetition becomes what it was originally supposed to be, which is a reminder of things that had happened in the previous episodes of the serial in case you either missed them or had forgotten them in the intervening week before they broadcast. Finally, if you watch Doctor Who in episodic form, it preserves the cliffhangers, and I love cliffhangers. It's kind of cyclical. I'm reasonably sure that I love cliffhangers because I watched cliffhangers in Doctor Who when I was growing up, and now because of that I like watching Doctor Who with cliffhangers. Although it extends to other things. I like cliffhangers in all sorts of shows. It's just an effect I enjoy. I'm reasonably sure that I know the resolutions to every single cliffhanger in classic Doctor Who, but that doesn't change the feeling it creates in me when I watch the cliffhanger on screen. It still leaves me with one of my favorite questions from when I was growing up. What happens next? Like a great many Doctor Who fans, I did not see An Unearthly Child on broadcast. It came out in 1963. I was born in 1974. So I was 11 years too late for that. Plus a couple of years to grow up and be able to, recognize images on a television. No, I started watching Doctor Who with the 70s stuff, with Tom Baker, and then I moved forward into Peter Davison and Colin Baker. I think I backtracked into Pertwee. It took me a long time to get around to seeing An Unearthly Child. By the time I got around to seeing it, I already knew an awful lot about it. I had read the novelization, I had seen articles about it, I just talked about it with other fans. The result of this is that I, like a lot of people, went into An Unearthly Child already knowing all the secrets to it. I knew who Susan was. I knew who the doctor was. I knew what was in the police box. I can only imagine what it must have been like to watch this the first time, to have those surprises be actual surprises, to see Ian and Barbara walk into the TARDIS for the first time and not know what was waiting for them inside. What amazed me the first time I saw it, and it still amazes me to this day, is how effective an episode it is, even when you know all the secrets. To be perfectly honest, I find the whole Hartnell era still very effective and atmospheric. It's an episode and a section of the series that I revisit an awful lot. It has such a raw, creative feeling where they were clearly sort of sounding out what would work and what wouldn't. And there's no formula to the show yet. They're still figuring it out. And just seeing them feel their way through that is fascinating. And because of that, I return to the Hartnell era pretty frequently. I mean, I've lost count of the amount of times I've actually watched An Unearthly Child, and will probably watch it again. Part of what makes it work is atmosphere. Atmosphere is one of those things that if you ask somebody about it, they sort of know what it means, but I think everyone defines it a little bit differently, possibly in relation to what it is they're applying it to. For me, when I talk about atmosphere in Doctor Who, or at least this era of Doctor Who, what I'm talking about is the feeling that there is something beyond the normal, something beyond the mundane. The idea that the normal world we live in is just a sort of a veneer over something underneath that's more fantastical, more strange, and more terrifying. Doctor Who is about hidden depths to me. That's what its atmosphere is about. I think this episode starts that off right from the first scene. We open with a scene of a policeman walking around outside a junkyard. Then as he moves away, the camera moves in on the door to the junkyard, which opens, and it opens without any real reason. There's no one there to open it. It's almost like it opens specifically for us, like it opened for the camera, which is already a bit weird. And then we get the focus on the police box. Now, it's 1963 when this is set and when it was broadcast, so a police box is not that unusual an object. But to start with, it's humming strangely, which already sets it apart from what a police box should be like. And second of all, there's the mere fact that we're focusing on it at all. The fact that the episode is focused on this mundane object is an indicator that there's something more to this than just its normalcy. And we then move on to other scenes, so the mere fact that it's being focused on indicates it is something we're going to come back to and something that is important in a way that a police box just shouldn't be. If I'm being perfectly honest, I think the atmosphere in Doctor Who starts even before that first scene. I think it starts right with the title sequence. The music for Doctor Who is weird. Doctor Who's theme is strange. It's odd and it's sort of discordant, especially this original version of it. It would be tempting, I think, if your job was to create a theme for Doctor Who, given the brief of what it's about, which is basically about people traveling to different times and having adventures, to give it a sort of a jaunty and adventure-y theme, one that sort of stressed adventure and daring do. But that's not what they go for. They go for something that stresses how strange it all is. And then they follow it up with visuals that are just these strange blobby things floating around in black and white that eventually form, the word Doctor Who. It's not designed to tell you that you're about to go on a cool adventure. It's designed to show you that something weird and odd is about to happen. I think it's interesting to note that later on in the classic series, and certainly in the new series, they've often had to create sort of incidental music themes for different characters and different events that stress the adventure aspect, because you can't just pull that from Doctor Who's main theme. Doctor Who's main theme is not about adventure, it's about strangeness. Incidentally, if I remember correctly, those light blobs were created by taking the camera and filming down its own lens to create a feedback loop. It's an odd look, and it's one that will last through a few title sequences. For throwing you off and making things seem strange and discordant, it's pretty effective. So, after we open the story and we set a little atmosphere, we get into the plot. An Unearthly Child is essentially a detective story. It's Ian and Barbara's investigation into what's going on with Susan, their very odd student, trying to figure out what her deal is. It even borrows from the tropes of detective stories. I mean, they effectively interrogate Susan, they follow her, they stake out where they expect her to be. They have what can best be described as a hostile interrogation with her grandfather. And then everything goes off the rails as soon as they enter the TARDIS. It's also worth noting that An Unearthly Child makes use of flashbacks. Flashbacks are not a common storytelling device in Doctor Who. I can think of only a few times when they show up. Most of them are in the new series. I'm not even sure there are any more of them in classic series. Oh, that's not true. There's one that shows up in Galaxy 4. But apart from that, nothing really comes to mind. It's not a usual device. But again, this is the early days. They're still figuring out how they want to tell their stories. More than that, the flashbacks reinforce the atmosphere, that sense of the strange. They're shot very oddly. They're shot from the points of view of Ian and Barbara as they speak to Susan. And they highlight odd moments where she acted strangely and out of sync with how they expected a 15-year-old to act. And there is, again, sort of discordant incidental music as it goes on, which means, again, they're emphasizing the oddness of things, the strangeness of things. So, as I said, Ian and Barbara have their investigation, and that comes to a screeching halt as soon as they enter the TARDIS. The TARDIS is the payoff for that atmosphere. It is the something strange beyond the normal. It is the oddity that's been hiding behind all the little clues as they've been trying to figure out what's been going on. The TARDIS is also the show's original special effect, the room that is bigger on the inside than on the outside. Now, it's not really much of a special effect, it's just a scene change. But in terms of the story, it is the first thing they encounter that falls so outside their concept of the normal that they have to acknowledge that the world is not what they thought it to be. In keeping with that atmosphere, it's also worth noting that later on in the series, as you watch it, the TARDIS will tend to convey a feeling of safety. When it arrives, you feel like help has arrived, and when you're inside it, you feel like nothing can get at you. Or at least you feel nothing can get at the companions. That's not true in this one. The TARDIS is a trap in this episode. They've forced their way into it, and now they can't get out. Far from being reassuring, it's actually scary. That's also a trait its owner shares in this episode. And we'll get to him. But let's talk about the other characters first. Let us start with the titular Unearthly Child, Susan. Truth told, Susan is not one of my favorite characters in Doctor Who. A lot of that is based on, I think, her not fulfilling her potential in later episodes. But this is not the episode that makes me down on Susan. In this episode, she's fantastic. She shows so much potential just in that weird mix of youthful energy and oddness, and how strangely she fits in, and yet how obviously she wants to fit in. Susan's actions remind me of someone who's traveling abroad and they've read the brochure for the place they're traveling cover to cover, but they've never actually been there before. So while they know all the broad strokes, all the details are missing. She knows that Britain is going to go over to decimal-based currency, but you can't quite remember when it's going to happen. She is fascinated by, the charting music, because that's a sort of visceral experience that her foreknowledge probably didn't prepare her for. It's fascinating to watch. And a large part of that is Carol Ann Ford's performance. When I say that Susan is a character that I'm not always too thrilled with later, it's never about her performance. I think Carol Ann Ford is a great actress. And in this episode, she just knocks it out of the park. She portrays someone who is clearly meant to be young, but whose basic level of knowledge is just yards ahead of everyone else she meets, including the two main characters, Ian and Barbara. A lot of how Carol Ann Ford does this is she constantly portrays Susan as just a little bit off from everything. Her reactions are just slightly left of normal, not way out of whack, but not quite what they should be. You get that great camera shot when she's listening to the radio and starts taking her hand and doing a weird sort of almost formalized dance. Makes you wonder if that was how dancing was done on Gallifrey. Even her speech cadence is fascinating to me because she says everything really quickly. It's almost like she's storing up what she's trying to say and then blurting it out real fast. Her conversation doesn't sound naturalistic. It doesn't sound human. But it's close enough that nobody's going to assume she's an alien. Like I said, she really knocks that out of the park with her performance. She's fantastic. It's interesting, I think, in this episode, despite being so fascinating, Susan isn't so much portrayed as a rounded character as she is a mystery to be solved. The closest later equivalent in Doctor Who I can think of is Clara. But with Clara, they stretch it out over a whole season, and it's arguably less effective because of that. But with Susan, it's just an episode long, and it works really well. What she is the mystery for Ian and Barbara to solve. She is their route into that hidden world behind the normal that I was talking about. And that brings me to Ian and Barbara, who are effectively the main characters of the episode. They're us. They're the original perspective characters of Doctor Who. They're the people through whom we see things. It's through them that we experience what's going on. At this point, it's Ian and Barbara's story, not the Doctor's. Now, this wouldn't work if you didn't have good acting. And luckily, William Russell and Jacqueline Hill are very good actors. More than that, they have really good chemistry with each other, which means that Ian and Barbara have really good chemistry with each other. And that really makes it work. Both Ian and Barbara come off as normal people. But that doesn't mean they're not distinct from one another. They definitely have their own personalities. Barbara is considerably more serious. Although it's interesting, she's also self-aware and slightly self-critical of her own seriousness. One of the very first things we see her do is overreact to a light joke, but then catch herself and apologize for doing that. Ian is less serious. He's more carefree about things, and he's less judgmental about things, both about Barbara and about himself. One of the things I find fascinating is that over the course of their investigation, Barbara feels the need to justify what they're doing for Susan's welfare as a student, whereas Ian is willing to admit that this is mostly about curiosity, that they just want to know what Susan's deal is. It's not uncommon for Doctor Who fans to assume that Ian and Barbara eventually become a couple. In fact, I would go so far as to say that I tend to believe this. They seem very couple-ish by the time they leave in Season 2. And it leads me to wonder how close they were before the events of this episode. Just watching this episode, and as I said, I've watched it many, many times, I find myself thinking that they were reasonably friendly work colleagues, but not especially close friends. Like, I suspect that the reason Barbara came to Ian for help with Susan is because both of them had Susan in their class, not because he's her work confidant. I suspect that effectively it is the events of the series that forged them into closer friends and arguably a couple. What they do have in common is that they're both drawn to finding out what's going on with Susan. They're both interested in what's hidden behind the normal, even if they don't quite grasp that it's not the normal. As mentioned, Barbara feels slightly more need to justify it, but the truth is that curiosity and just wanting to know clearly plays a part in both of their motivations. In terms of Ian and Barbara's characters, it's interesting to look at them in terms of their sort of traditional gender roles. When you first start, they fall pretty much into the stereotypes for 60s characters. Ian is largely easygoing and rational about everything, whereas Barbara seems more ruled by intuition and emotion. You know, it's very telling that she's the one who stops and says that she feels as though they're about to interfere in something that's best left alone, and Ian's the one who just sort of blows that off and keeps moving. What I find interesting is that at the end, once they're inside the TARDIS, that almost reverses. Ian is the one who emotionally can't handle what's going on, whereas Barbara, I wouldn't say she's taking it in stride, but she's coping much better with the situation that they're in. Now, part of that, I think, is because of their original worldviews. I think Ian is a science teacher. He's used to the world making rational sense. He even mentions earlier that he expects to find a more simple explanation for all this. He's just not sure what it is. So when the explanation turns out to be something beyond his understanding, he can't really cope. Barbara, on the other hand, seems to have already been, not sure, but emotionally prepped for the idea that they might be walking into something that's outside their understanding. So while she is still scared and she is still worried, she's not having as much trouble accepting it. As she says, she just believes them. And then, of course, we get to the Doctor himself. Or can we even really call him the Doctor at this point? I mean, yes, he gets credited as Doctor Who in the credits, as he will for years. But he doesn't get named in this story. He's basically just the old man in the junkyard, or Susan's grandfather, as we eventually find out. But he doesn't get named. The closest they come to it is that when they're talking in the school earlier, Ian mentions that Susan's grandfather is a doctor, he believes. So, the old man. What is he in this story? He is the barrier between the normal and the strange. He is what's preventing Ian and Barbara from finding out what's really going on. He is that in a metaphysical sense, in that when they get by him, that's when they're going to be able to find out what's going on. And in a physical sense, he literally tries to physically prevent them from entering the TARDIS at one point. He is that atmosphere personified, the barrier between what we think is going on and what's really going on. Now, if, like me and a great many Doctor Who fans, you started watching the show later, it's very easy to be surprised by how the Doctor acts in this episode. He seems very far from the character that we're going to see later. But I think it's worth noting, when you watch the later episodes, that somewhere deep at his core, this part of the Doctor is always there. He's obviously hiding something. He's clearly not trustworthy. he is importantly missing the sense of reassurance that he'll have later. Later on in Doctor Who, when the Doctor shows up, you feel safer. You feel like he's there to rescue you. Not that the Doctor always manages to rescue everyone, but your chances are much better when he's there. There's no sense of reassurance here. If anything, he's a source of fear. He's making you feel worse, not better. With apologies to Terrence Dick's later description, the Doctor in this episode is both cruel and cowardly. But, as I said, I think this part of the Doctor that we see right from the beginning is always a part of the character going forward. If anything, I think it kind of reinforces Stephen Moffat's later interpretation of the name the Doctor being a persona that the actual Doctor aspires to be. On good days he gets there, on bad days he doesn't, most days he's somewhere in between. But what you're seeing all through Doctor Who is this person that we meet in an unearthly child trying to live up to being more than that. And I actually find that a fascinating way to look at it. It's almost more admirable than watching someone who is inherently good, because you know that they are constantly trying to better themselves. They're trying to be better than their instincts would have them be. All of that said, there are little hints in this episode of who the Doctor is later going to be. It's almost like we're watching a proto-version of him that hasn't quite reached Doctorness. And one of the ways you can tell this is by sort of the tactics he makes use of in the episode. It's almost like the building blocks of who the Doctor is are there, but they haven't yet been fully constructed. I mean, the Doctor, as we see him in this episode, is arrogant, and the Doctor will always be arrogant. But, importantly in this episode, the arrogance is actually more bothersome because it's being aimed at our perspective characters. Often, later on, the Doctor's arrogance is almost sort of endearing, because, and something that, you can sort of poke holes in, and that's funny. But at this point, it's just bothersome. It just makes him unpleasant. There's also the fact that the Doctor's preferred tactic to try and keep Ian and Barbara out of the TARDIS is verbal trickery. He tries to talk them out of doing it. He tries to sort of defeat them with words. And this is a tactic we'll see the Doctor use many, many, many times in the future. He's not actually that good at it in this episode. They keep poking holes in what he says. But then I don't think he's actually been doing it very long. Arguably, the meanest thing, the cruelest thing that the Doctor does in this episode is allow Ian to be shocked when he touches a control on the TARDIS console. He may even cause it. If you watch the scene carefully, you can see the Doctor go up and flip another switch as Ian's about to touch it. Now, I don't know if the Doctor was charging the switch that Ian was going to touch with electricity, or if he was just cutting it off from the rest of the control so that Ian couldn't actually do any damage to the TARDIS. But, at best, the Doctor knew Ian was about to be shocked. And at worst, he caused it to happen. But again, that's a tactic we'll see the Doctor use a lot. I mean, how many times have we seen the Doctor trick someone into using technology that's dangerous, and that's how he wins? It's just that, again, it seems cruel here because he's not doing it to a villain, he's doing it to our main character. The Doctor has a really insensitive line in the episode comparing Ian and Barbara to Red Indians. It's an insensitive line now, and it was an insensitive line then. But I'm not bothered by its existence in the episode. It reminds me of a writing exercise I remember being put through where the idea was that you write some dialogue from one character's point of view, and they have to be talking about another character. But the goal is to have their dialogue tell more about themselves than about the subject they're talking about. And I feel like this line serves that purpose in the episode. The Doctor may be denigrating, essentially Native Americans, and he's denigrating Ian and Barbara, but what the line is telling the audience is what an arrogant elitist the Doctor is, and how little he thinks of the intellectual capacity of everyone around him. It's telling us more about the Doctor than it is about who he's talking about. I said earlier that I was going to talk about why I choose and prefer the broadcast version to the unaired pilot version of the episode. And the end of the episode is really the source of that. In the pilot episode, the Doctor has a sort of pseudo-scientific, almost Moffat-esque, timey-wimey reason for kidnapping Ian and Barbara. Essentially, even though he's being a jerk about it, he's sort of justified by the rules of time travel that he can't let them go. In the broadcast version, that's dispensed with, and it is clear that his only motivation in this is wanting to stay with his granddaughter, and wanting to leave with her too. I prefer that version. I prefer it to be a more character-based notion, and frankly a slightly more selfish-based notion, than him actually being justified in his actions, even if it's a cruel justification. In terms of that motivation, it's clear from their discussion in this episode that the Doctor and Susan have had this argument many, many times before. She wants to stay because she feels like this is a place where she can belong. He wants to leave because, well, A, because he doesn't like it here, and B, because he's got wanderlust. Another trait of the later Doctor that is showing up early. So what you get here is sort of an escalating series of bluffs as they try to have the argument out. He says that they need to leave because Ian and Barbara will talk, and that will give away who they are. That one probably isn't a bluff. He's probably right about that. Susan insists that they won't. I think she's probably wrong about that, but she's clinging to it. Then she makes a claim about how she'd rather stay than leave with him in the TARDIS. That if he goes, she wants to stay. And he calls that bluff and basically tells her she can go. And then she holds to it. I think she's bluffing. I think she's just trying to get her grandfather to let Ian and Barbara go, and then she'll stay. She just also wants to stay in 1963, too. But, importantly, the Doctor falls for that bluff. However, he's not willing to let her go, so he just launches the ship into motion, which starts the journey that's still going almost 60 years now, and will probably continue beyond that. So, I think we should all be grateful that the Doctor fell for it. Of course, none of this would work if William Hartnell wasn't such a fantastic actor. He is absolutely mesmerizing when he's on the screen. He's the only one you want to look at. His facial expressions, the way he talks with his hands, it's probably where I got it. His little sort of Shakespearean asides, which on the one hand are very theatrical, but on the other hand kind of give the impression that he just thinks Ian and Barbara are too stupid to talk to, so he'd rather just talk to the air, he'd talk to himself, rather than talk directly to them. The episode is set up to make Susan the mystery, but by the end of it, it's her grandfather you really want to know more about. Hartnell's performance carries what was already a good episode into being a great episode, and he makes you want to watch more of him. It's interesting to note how this episode can fit with later continuity that we know is going to happen. In terms of Susan and the Doctor, I tend to assume that they haven't been away from Gallifrey that long. I know that in later episodes they make mention of having had some trips before they landed in 1963, but you don't get the impression they've been gone that long because of Susan's inability to sort of interact with people and the Doctor's extreme arrogance and inability to recognize that anyone he meets might have anything to contribute. It's basically like he's still holding on to that Time Lord level of superiority. It's also interesting to ponder why they've stayed in 1963 so long. Now, we know that he and Susan have been having an ongoing argument about whether they should stay or whether they should go. But this episode itself shows that the Doctor is willing to take action to win that argument. He does it right in the end of the episode. So I'm left to wonder why he hasn't done that before this. I mean, he could settle this argument really easily. Susan goes to sleep. He starts the TARDIS moving. Argument over. She'll be upset, but he'll have won and she'll still be with him. I find myself wondering if the answer doesn't lie in some of the future continuity. We will get a story that revisits this remembrance of the Daleks. And we will learn that while the Doctor was here, he was in the process of hiding a Time Lord artifact called the Hand of Omega, a very powerful one, that he clearly didn't want other people to find. I find myself wondering if the Doctor has spent the last 5 months trying to find an appropriate place for the Hand of Omega. Even when we get to Remembrance of the Daleks, we know that he's found a place, but he hasn't actually gotten it there yet. So if that's the process he's going through, if the Hand of Omega hasn't been placed yet, and so his work in 1963 isn't done yet, then all of the arguments he's been having with Susan about staying or going have been theoretical, have been about whether or not they're going to stay or go when he's done. And we know he's not done yet. So what we get in this episode is him taking off in the TARDIS because he feels his hand has been forced, not because he just can. I think that's an interesting way to look at it. It isn't very evident in this episode, and it doesn't need to be very evident in this episode. It just needs to fit with the larger continuity. Now, on the flip side, it's also interesting to look at this episode in terms of the continuity that didn't happen. The hints of things that could have been, but they didn't end up going that way. In the unaired pilot version, when Susan is talking about where she and her grandfather come from, she specifically says they're from the 49th century, which nails down their origins to a specific time frame. That goes away in the broadcast version, and she just says they're from another time, another world. Again, I prefer the broadcast version. I prefer more mystery to their origins. So it's interesting to see that they didn't walk themselves into that. There's also the Doctor's dialogue about how he and Susan are exiles, cut off from their own planet and their own people. Now, you can make this work with later episodes when we find out that the Doctor left Gallifrey voluntarily. It can fit. You just have to stretch the definition of exile into sort of a self-exile. But taken on its surface in just this episode, it gives the impression that the Doctor actually sort of regrets his inability to go back, and that they are effectively on the run. I know that some of the ideas for the background that they'd been kicking around at this point were that the Doctor and Susan were essentially aristocracy where they'd come from. There'd been some sort of revolution, and they'd had to flee afterward. That's an interesting perspective. They didn't go with it, but it's interesting to wonder where they might have gone. The idea that they were actively fleeing and actively on the run as opposed to just wandering around. It's also interesting to note that there's nothing in this episode that implies that the TARDIS is one of many. It could just as easily be a unique craft. If anything, Susan has the line about how she'd made up the initials for the name, time and relative dimension in space. That almost implies it is a unique craft. So now I find myself wondering if the initial conception was something along the lines of this revolution happened, the Doctor wanted to escape with his granddaughter and be free, so they stole this singular, unique craft and escaped in time and space. It's a fascinating way to conceptualize the series, even if it didn't turn out to be what they went with. It reminds me a little bit of an old Japanese cartoon called UFO Robot Grandizer, where one planet got invaded by another, and the prince from the invaded planet stole the most powerful ship/war machine from the invaders and escaped with it. It has that same sort of fleeing royalty feel to it. All of these possibilities and how they compare to how things turned out remind me that Doctor Who is kind of a triumph of backloaded storytelling. I suppose a better word for backloaded storytelling, or a better term for it, is making it up as you go along. I honestly think backloaded storytelling gets a bit of a bad rap. I think there's a great deal of unbridled creativity to not having everything mapped out ahead of time, but just moving forward and seeing where things go. That's not to say I don't like front-loaded storytelling. Incidentally, if you want to see the triumph of front-loaded storytelling, it's Babylon 5. Great series. And the truth of the matter is that there's usually a bit of back and forth. You know, a lot of stories where you're making it up as you go along, you do have a vague idea where you're going, or you have it plotted out to a certain point. But I think there's more value in having the road forward be entirely open than people give credit for. It allows you to branch off and try new things that a more structured, pre-planned, front-loaded story simply can't do. And obviously it's been working for a while. Doctor Who's coming up on 60 years. In addition to that unbridled creativity, there are lots of little touches I like in this episode. I mentioned Susan making the mistake about England having a decimalized currency system. I've always found that one particularly clever. There was already talk at the time of broadcast about switching over to that, but it hadn't happened yet. In fact, I don't think it would actually happen until we reach the 70s. But it was already being spoken about, which means it was already part of the national conversation. So presenting that as something Susan knows is going to happen is a reasonable extrapolation from the future. Even if it didn't happen, even if in 2022 the UK still didn't have decimalized currency, you could still present it as something Susan knows will happen in the future that just hasn't happened yet. You just posit that it happens 800 years into the future instead of 8 years into the future. And it fits with the presentation of Susan as someone who knows the broad strokes, but not the details of where and when she is. There are other little touches I like too. Ian mentions not having any matches when they're in the junkyard. That's a nice bit of foreshadowing that will be important in the next few episodes. I also like that there's lots of little knickknacks in the TARDIS. There's, a chair and a sculpture and that clock that the Doctor apparently can't seem to get to work right. I've always kind of liked the idea that the TARDIS should have more clutter, that the Doctor should collect more things. If there's anything about ongoing TARDIS design that I don't like, it's that I think the Doctor should have more stuff that he's picked up from his various travels. Although that having been said, the TARDIS version with the most interior clutter is the version from the 1996 TV movie, and I don't really like that version that much, so maybe I should re-examine that. Maybe the clutter isn't as important as I think it is. I don't like to dwell on negative things in episodes. It's just not the way I tend to analyze things. But sometimes things are both negative and funny. The bit in the end where the TARDIS starts to take off and Ian and Barbara fall over because everything's shaking just amuses me because it's the most comfortable, easy, leisurely fall you've ever seen. Barbara very conveniently lands in a comfy chair, and Ian very conveniently holds onto the chair so as to not hit his head when he falls down. It doesn't look like people falling. It looks like people just sort of slowly sitting down for a nap. For that matter, why does the TARDIS shake on takeoff? It doesn't do that later. Usually when it takes off, it's just moving. It just leaves with no interior shake. I would hazard a guess that it's probably because Susan essentially tackles her grandfather when he's in the middle of the takeoff process, and which probably means he either flipped a switch he shouldn't have or didn't flip a switch he needed to. So I think that pretty much explains that. Speaking of the TARDIS's takeoff, it's really trippy. You get that great picture of London fading into the background, and then it shifts into a recreation of the title sequence with all those white blobs made by the camera looking down its own lens. It's not the last time that the show's current title sequence will get presented as what it looks like to travel through the time vortex. I've often found it interesting at various points in the series, when they want to show the time vortex, they almost invariably show whatever the current title sequence is at the time. Which means, of course, that the time vortex's look changes an awful lot over the course of the series, but it always matches with what the current title sequence was. So it's a weird sort of inconsistent consistency. And then, of course, there's the cliffhanger. We land, well, the TARDIS lands on what looks to be a field with a bunch of sand and rock, and then we see what looks to be a humanoid shadow moving over it, telling us not only that the TARDIS has moved, but that it's moved somewhere where there's something threatening watching it. It's a great cliffhanger. Not the best they'll have, but it's a good one for the first episode. So, those are my general thoughts on An Unearthly Child. I'm really curious to hear what other people think. Feel free to comment below. I'd love to see other people's opinions, whether they agree with mine or not. And next time, we'll find out what happens after that cliffhanger. We'll find out what happens next.